Hello and welcome to another deck tech for some EDH decks here. Again, I'm still running through a couple decks I'm dismantling. So before I actually get to my good decks, I'm just going to throw out a couple that I'm in the process of just disassembling and taking apart. But some of them are just clever enough that, like, for example, Adamaro here, he's just a rare general, so I thought I might as well share him. This is a mono-red EDH deck. I have a passion for having a difficult time to play the game. Mono-red is the worst color in EDH, and it's just not that good. So I like a good challenge. What Adamaro here is a 3 mana for an XX, where X is equal to the greatest number of cards in your opponent's hand. So he is potentially a 7/7 or more. What this deck tries to do is just swing with general to kill. Like, you really want to give him trample and just start swinging and beating face as soon as possible. This is the third version of this deck I've built. The first two were based on land destruction, using the cards that did like 4 damage to all creatures, everyone destroys or sacks 4 lands. Or Epicenter, everyone sacks all their lands after have a giant pile of artifact mana out, which means that he is then left alone to grow bigger and bigger and keep beating face. My play group doesn't like me playing land destruction, even though it's one of my favorite mechanics. It is a legitimate way of winning, but people don't like it. So I built a different way. Most Adamaro decks you will see, like all deck lists you'll see, have some kind of group hug effect. And I decided to capitalize on that in this one, to just make as much of a chaotic group hug effect as possible. To make him not as big of a target, but still want to go through the win. This deck usually goes best against 1 to 2 opponents. I usually do multiplayer EDH. Past 3-ish to 4 opponents, it becomes unreliable, because then you are obviously no longer capable of sustaining a good control on the game. So I do have a backup general, which is just a chroma. We'll start with some creatures here. Mono red doesn't have a lot of really strong anything. So we really have to rely on a lot of shenanigans to try and do it, and the good example of that is Goblin Welter. This is one of my old favorite cards. What he does is he just makes the person who controls an artifact sacrifice it, and then they get a target artifact from their graveyard to play. I usually do this to dick around with like Memory Jar or Duplicant or something like that, just so I can get a really good advantage on some cards, even though they've already been spent. A smart opponent will try to kill him as soon as possible just because of that. Then we have some mana accelerants. We have an Iron Mirror. Pilgrim's Eye is an old classic. A lot of people think he's stupid, but in mono red, really, the replacement effect and chump blocker is good. Another classic, this one tends to just wreck people. I try not to play it if like 1 or 2 opponents are playing like 5 color decks, because it's just not nice. Even though Blood Moon is still one of my favorite cards, and having a creature form is always handy. He's another staple in a lot of my mono red decks. It's a way of destroying artifacts and burning at the same time. He has a nice little butt on him, 1/3, so he can be a decent chump blocker, make people not want to bother swinging in at you. Really good mana acceleration, and if you are clever, you can recur it with the Goblin Welter and do it more than once. Really good card advantage. Viceling is kind of techie. He's not that smart. What he does, he just burns people, your opponents, on their upkeep if they have so many more cards in their hand. This is probably one of the worst creatures in the deck. I just wanted to play with it because he's a big 6/6. What he does is he has a upkeep cost where if you don't pay it, well, essentially if you don't sack it, then your opponents draw more cards. So technically you can make him a little bit bigger. This is a personal favorite. It doesn't really look that offensive. What it does is just kind of scramble opponents' hands. It's 4/4 2/2 haste trample. When he connects, it cycles that person's hand. Really good for disruption, and he can come out really quick. Well, if your opponents are going to have a really big stack of cards in their hand, why not just play some of them for free? More of a damage tech. Every time you draw, he burns. And he can get pretty big, but he usually ends up being a good chump blocker because you want him to stay alive no matter what. Firebombers is another one of my favorite cards. What he does is he reduces everyone down to 3 lands. And in this deck, he doesn't really have that high of a curve, so you can kind of slow down your opponents. Again, you want them to be drawing. And this isn't like a standard like draw death deck. You just want them to have a whole bunch of cards in their hand to keep him humongous, but you don't want them to play it. So you want to have him out, or play him at least once to knock their lands down. Herbrass is always great. Again, opponents are going to be trying to play shit as fast as possible since you're trying to help them draw more. So having them tap their creatures down gives you an open blocker. Good removal. Godo is going to go straight and get us a... Like, I don't have a good sword package in here. Actually, I don't think I have any swords. But what he really needs is trample. He is just a vanilla, whatever. So giving him trample is very important. So Godo usually goes straight for like the Warhammer or something like that. No, actually, I think he goes for Godo's Maul because, yeah, that's the one I usually go for. Sorry, it's been a few weeks since I played this. Dragon Mage is another way of cycling people's hands. It actually cycles everyone's hands. That could be helpful at times. He looks like a good threat. Sometimes he just baits out a kill spell because people don't want to lose what they have. By the time you can actually cast something for however 7 mana, then usually people already have like stacked and sculpted their hand to do whatever they want. They don't want you to hit them anymore. And Cozy's there just to cycle because we are too trying to draw a lot of cards we don't want to mill. On to the spells. I usually try and put this in all my mono red decks if there's room. It just wipes everyone's artifacts. If you're trying to blow everyone's hands up to large size, they're going to try and accelerate out, so of course they're going to try and play their artifacts if they can. A good wipe for the small creatures. Again, everyone's going to try and play as much as fast as possible, so this will wipe the smaller ones. Same. Drawing. Mono red just doesn't have good draw, and this is a way of just recycling one's hands. Again, you don't want everyone to have a really great stack of cards if they've been sculpting their hands well and discarding what excess they don't want. So this is actually this is better than normal in mono red, especially with him, and in this style of deck. This can basically do the same thing, except they draw only how much they discard, and you also tend to do damage because there's just a massive number of artifacts in this deck. Again, you want to remove some of their artifact accelerant if possible, and these two are probably not the smartest cards. Like, I just played this one because it's on theme, and because that's on theme, that must be on theme, of course. It just does damage to an opponent equal to the number of cards in their hand. Another cycle effect, basically Wheel of Fortune plus 1 or 2 or more mana, or maybe not. And of course, some kind of wipe effect, because we don't want to have a whole bunch of creatures on the board swinging at us when we want us to have the only big creature. This will probably kill him, of course, though. We only run 1 walker. I'm not a fan of Chandra and EDH, but Koth himself can be a win condition. If you watch my other video, you know that I try not to go for the emblem because that puts a target on your head, even though you're probably going to have a target anyways for what you're doing. But that mana acceleration is a godsend. It's just something that if you're playing mono red and EDH, you would probably want this as one of the first cards you actually try and trade or buy. Onto the artifacts. That is the horrible thing about mono red. The downside of playing this color is just the sheer ease it is for your opponents to destroy artifacts. Most people think that red is the artifact destruction color, but nowadays in EDH with shenanigans with like Deadeye Navigator and Acidic Slime, it's just there's such a massive percent of your deck that is vulnerable. We'll start with mana acceleration. This deck really wants a lot of mana acceleration because you want to play as much stuff as possible that you get with your draw tech. So we got a Vault, we got a Soul Ring, this actually gets you a land into play, which is really helpful. This can replace itself late game if you don't need it, gives you red mana, potentially gives you red mana, it's just another 2-drop artifact. 2-drop artifact, this one won't go away. And these two just double your mana. I try not to play these because this will put a target on your head. There's no like giant X spell unless I'm running her for fire breathing. But just being able to play out so many of your cards with both of these is just, you kind of need it. I do have a Gauntlet of Might that's in another deck. That one only affects mountains. You don't have a choice like this one does. But again, that's something that the rarity of the card itself tends to cause you to get unwanted attention, and that can backfire. Onto the equipment. We want him to be safe. We want him to stay alive as much as possible. So we have some boots. This one's fun because you can bust him in the air every time you draw. If he's equipped on your upkeep and you draw, he flies. Then you can also pay to draw, which in this deck, if you just stalled out or someone wiped everything, that's going to be really helpful. Trample, trample, trample. And on to the actual artifact support. We always have some way of dumping. If someone is, of course, like draw deathing themselves, or if you're somehow overdoing it, or they have some tricks in their graveyard, this is just a EDH staple. I don't usually run it, but in this deck where I'm just overloading people's hands or trying to, it tends to help. This can be anything I want it to be. Sphere of Resistance is a novelty card, probably something that's not going to stay in the deck. Well, actually, I'm dismantling the deck, doesn't matter. What it does is essentially it makes everything cost 1 more. Again, you want him out first and some trample, and then just drop this and keep on swinging. Yeah. Ebony Owl is there's an old standard deck called Howling Owl or Owling Mine. where essentially it just burns people for 4 if they have more than 7 in their upkeep. So sometimes this can net just 4 damage consistently, or sometimes it's a dead draw. This is probably the most important card for draw tech when it comes to Adamaro, because you don't want your opponents to have to discard down to 7 if they have more than 7. This removes their maximum hand size. Howling Mine. This is another fun one. This is more of a novelty card. It probably doesn't deserve to be in the deck, but it's just someone gave it to me and I liked it and I wanted to find a place for it. What it does is it taps and you can give a creature +1/+1 flying and trample and first strike until end of turn. So of course you can bust them in the air and give them trample. It's more of a clever card really. It could just be a better bit of equipment. Temple Bell, draw tech, draw tech, draw tech, draw tech. This is a fun one too. This is actually probably one of my favorites. I think the best I've ever gotten this thing up to was I got, I think, like almost 15 or more counters on it. And I just refused to let everyone draw. I was being a tormenting little asshole. And then all of a sudden everyone was drawing like 15 cards a turn. It was great. This one will put some hate on you or it will do absolutely nothing. What it does is on everyone's turn they can play a second land, but whenever land is tapped it bounces to their hand. So again, this can maybe backfire, maybe it'll help someone accelerate out faster, or maybe it will do nothing, or maybe you'll wreck the person who just ramped out ridiculously and was waiting to play something big. Good way of laying life. You always want to have maximum hand size since we're trying to draw more cards. Draw tech, draw tech. And finally the lands. I don't like using a lot of non-basic lands in my decks, even like my multicolor decks. I try to avoid it because even though I'm usually the guy running land destruction in my decks or in my play group, I know the potential and how devastating it is, so I tend to rely on basics when possible. But that doesn't stop me from having a good setup. So I always have Inkmoth Nexus. This is always a fun card. Give it some kind of equipment. You can all of a sudden use Infect as a win condition. Draw land. Of course, we want to have an infinite hand size. And no mono red deck is complete without the Valakut, but most people also forget the Train Generator, which lets you drop extra basics. Always handy. Then I have 33 basic mountains. Really, that's a lot of basics. But that's the deck for Adamaro. Again, this one doesn't run massive land destruction. The previous decks were probably better because he was always having higher toughness and those land destruction spells would burn the creatures for, so he would survive. But I wanted a more interesting and more reactive deck, and doing this kind of build sort of did that. But this is more of a filler deck. I normally don't play 2 mono red decks in my main decks. I have 3 classifications of EDH decks. I have the common ones, I have ones that are like, they're actually something I invest money into and then try with to be competitive. This is obviously not competitive. And then I have like Gucci decks. I normally in my common decks, I have 1 mono red deck at all times, and I have some combination of Grixis Call or something or other. But he basically, I just had these extra cards and I was like, I have enough to make out tomorrow again, so I put them together. But again, I want some of the cards out of here for another deck I'm building, so he's going to be disbanded. But I'll always keep him. He's always a fun general. He's just rare. This was my 2nd general I used in mono red, and I think just from that nostalgia is why I keep wanting to rebuild him some way, shape, or form. But he's just not that good. Like, if your play group is maybe full of not a whole bunch of spikes, not a lot of competitive people, or maybe if you're just looking for something really interesting and really different, then he would be a good approach. But you have to remember that the big fault of mono red is the weakness to like non-creature destruction. And mono red has to rely on a massive amount of artifacts to be functional. Not good, just functional. And because of that, I mean, it's so easy to get nuked. Literally, like the card Bane of Progress is probably the one card that just nukes this deck. I used to run Torpor Orb in my play group because 3 people were playing like 2 were playing a Blink deck and 1 was playing like a Damia Enter the Battlefield like combo win deck. And Torpor Orb was my only way of stopping them. But when they all started deciding to play Bane of Progress as well, I was like, okay, you guys are assholes. Like, I can go off on a pretty big tangent about how pathetic mono red is, but I play it because I like a challenge. So I can't really talk about how shitty it is, even though it's pretty shitty. But stay tuned. I have a lot of decks. These 2 are going to be gone. I am putting together my Latoya Keldon Overseer deck for, I think, the 5th time. So that will be my next mono red common deck. Although she's just not that strong. I just like the idea of red control. But I do have a few other decks I'm going to be showing shortly. I think I have a Jaleva deck that's still functional, although she is maybe shortly becoming a Croesus, basically a reckless Grixis deck, because I'm tired of playing Grixis without actually utilizing the general. But yeah, I just have a giant pile of decks coming up, so stay tuned.